This is now pulling me into pelvic rotation, and so I'm actually resisting it on the front hip. Hey, what's going on guys? Ben Brewster here with TreadAthletics.com. Today I want to talk about a couple progressions for working on a proper front leg brace for guys that really struggle, and basically a new twist on how to work on it. And it's not just a simple throwing drill or a new cue, but fundamentally a different way of looking at how the front leg is working, and some reasons as to why certain guys, no matter how many reps they do, they're just not going to be able to get it until they take a little bit of a step back and address what could be an underlying cause here. So we as coaches, when we see an athlete, maybe they land and their front leg continues to leak, they land with quite a bit of knee flexion and it keeps leaking, or that knee begins to bow out, or the foot begins to bow out, or they don't get that clawback mechanism where as the pelvis rotates, that front leg begins to extend, the knee begins to extend. When we see inefficient front legs, sometimes we just assume it's a patterning thing, it's a timing thing, and a lot of times it is. But that being said, if you ever work with an athlete, or you are an athlete yourself, and you've tried just about everything, you've tried various drills, nothing seems to work, and your body just doesn't seem to want to get into these certain positions, that's where I think there's a lot of value to these drills specifically. Not that there's not value to players who have good front legs to work on some of these drills I'm about to show you, but for guys who just can't seem to get it to click no matter what they do, that front leg just does not want to get in a good position, then I think taking a step back and addressing the eccentric control of the pelvis over top of that front leg as it rotates into landing, I think that's going to be potentially the cure for a lot of athletes out there who just can't seem to figure it out. So when I was talking about eccentric control, we're basically looking at as the pelvis rotates over top of the femur. So we have a fixed front foot into the ground. Just to review the clawback mechanism, we have a fixed front foot into the ground at landing. Our upper body is stacked over our pelvis. The pelvis is presumably almost fully open into landing, but as rotation continues, that pelvis continues to rotate. Again, we have a fixed front foot, and because that pelvis is rotating all the way through, that front hip continues to rotate around. It's actually rotating posteriorly now. It pulls that knee into extension by completing that rotation into ball release. So that's the clawback mechanism, but to be able to do that, we need control of that pelvis over top of that femur. So we need control of the femoral head in the acetabulum, but in a pitching specific way, not just looking at like a sideline clamshell where the fixed point is the body and we're just moving the femur. So we have a pitching specific way of looking at it, and we need to be able to establish control, eccentric control of the adduction and internal rotation that takes place on this front femur. Get in a split stance. Don't overextend the back leg. So get a little bit of knee flexion in the back leg, plant, and then from here, put both hands on your pelvis, one on either side of the pelvis, and I want you to be able to feel, keep that front foot grounded into the ground. I want you to be able to feel the pelvis and the relationship between the pelvis and that front knee. So there's not a push from the quad. As the pelvis rotates, it pulls that front knee into extension. So we start back here, upper body stacked over our pelvis, and I want you to feel that rotation of the pelvis over the femur. At this very end position, you should feel like you've wound up tension into that front hip, into the lateral hip, into the glute med. You should feel like you're winding tension into there. And then I want you to reverse that, contract the lateral hip musculature, and come back. So this is just building awareness, control of that ball and socket rotation of the hip. We're not trying to exactly mimic your throwing mechanics here. It's just building awareness and control of what does my front hip, what does my body do when I get to landing? Do I just crumple over top of it? Or can I begin to build some awareness of that rotation, adduction in that eccentric pattern? From there, it's eccentric control. It's overloading a little bit of resistance to that. So here's one way you can do that. Now I don't have a core velocity belt with me right now, but shout out to Lance Wheeler. I think that would be the best way to overload this, is take the core velocity belt and just take your back hip with a loop and attach the band there. I'm just gonna use a regular resistance band for the sake of this, but the core velo belt would probably be an easier way to set this up. And same thing, this is now pulling me into pelvic rotation, and so I'm actually resisting it on the front hip as it pulls me into that finished position. So this is eccentric control, adding a little bit of loading to that same pattern. Notice I'm still getting that clawback mechanism. That knee flexion angle is increasing as the pelvis completes its rotation. And I'm feeling all of this tension. I'm feeling the lateral hip. I'm feeling all the tension there, and that begins to stretch and wind up as I let the pelvis rotate through. We're going to use this in a second to overload that, but progression number 3 is called a hip airplane. You might have seen this before. If you haven't done these before, you can use something like a pole for balance, which I'll show you in a second. But you basically get in a single leg RDL position, and then from there, you're opening up over top of that femur. Single leg RDL. Now, as we get into this position, you want your upper half and your pelvis to rotate as one so that it doesn't become a low back exercise. For the sake of this, you're just trying to isolate upper half, pelvis, they rotate together, and you want to feel those both rotate over top. So the only movement that's happening is happening from the actual hip joint. So from here, you're going to open up as far as you can go, come back down. So you can see I've been doing this for a while. You can see how difficult that is from a balance standpoint, but you want to be able to build up to where you can do 10 or 15 reps of that and it doesn't feel like you're just falling all over the place. You have good control, good dynamic stability, good control of not just your overall body, your center of mass, but of specifically that front hip. You can actually turn this into more of a strength movement. These really burn you out in the same way that clamshells would, same way that monster walks would, while also giving you some of that stability aspect into it as well. So what you can do, add the band. This is a crossover symmetry hip halo. I really, really love this product. Probably gonna write a review on it pretty soon. So this is basically set up the band just over the knees. If you put it too high, it has a tendency to kind of ride up. So you want it just above the knees, and it's just a much more difficult version of the hip airplane. And again, I'm trying to rotate just from my pelvis and keep my upper half and my pelvis moving in the same plane at the same time for the sake of this. Okay, so you'll see as you get fatigued, it's going to be more and more difficult. So you might do a set of 10 and you get fatigued and you start wobbling. That's where you're going to go and finish out your set with a pole or something for balance. So what I like to do is use my glove arm as the balance and the other arm, put it on my chest or my pelvis just to ensure that this all rotates simultaneously. So find that glute, flat back, weight through the heel, and then from here, finish off. Again, the point of this isn't as much the concentric, it's really focusing on controlling down on the eccentric. So you'll find it challenging both directions, but really focus on that eccentric control on the way down. And again, notice I'm really focusing on not torquing through my back and keeping it a pelvic driven movement. Give those a try, the hip airplane, loaded and unloaded, and also just a landing position, split stance where you're focusing on pelvic rotation, unloaded and loaded. But again, for guys who have been working on their front leg, haven't been making a whole lot of progress, you might need to take a step back and fundamentally rethink how your body is able to activate and control the pelvis over top of the femur. So give those a try. I think from there, you'll see a lot more effectiveness of all the other front leg drills that you're doing and be able to better incorporate your pelvis and the relationship to your front leg into the rest of your throwing drills.